Hello, my friends. Thank you again for joining me in our study of Catholicism and the Antichrist. I just wanted to say, as we're drawing near to the close of this 16-week series, this is our next to last lesson. I just want to say thank you to all those of you stuck with me that have been a part of this. We've got folks who view this literally around the world. Uganda, Kenya, India, all across the United States, other places. And I'm just so very thankful, and I'm complimented that you would take your time to spend with me so that we could share some of these things together. I hope that it's been beneficial to you. As we begin to try to wrap this series up with regards to Catholicism, I'm going to do two things. Tonight, I want to talk about one of the most important things, as far as I'm concerned, with regards to pointing out the Antichrist doctrines of Catholicism. And then next time, I want to I'm not going to call it a review because I'm going to give you new material, but it's going to be material that's going to be bullet point stuff that I'm going to just share with you just really quickly as to how it's pretty obvious that Jesus says this, Catholics do that, Antichrist. Jesus says this, Catholics do that, Antichrist. And so I hope that you'll stick with me for these last two times together. Again, if you want to be credible, quote God. He is the author and finisher of all good things in our faith, etc. And so if you want to be credible, quote God. Yes, I do believe in sola scriptura, to borrow a phrase from the Catholic Church. They use that to actually attempt to discredit the idea that God is enough. But I want you to know that I am convinced that God is enough and that His Word tells us what we need to know. And that, in fact, I would suggest to you that His Word will actually translate, interpret, give us the various genre uniquenesses, facets of what we need to know. It'll interpret His own words. So God interprets Himself. How cool is that? All right, here we go. As you know, we always start off with these 5 questions so that those of you who are part of the School of Biblical Studies, you can have them to kind of have a heads up of what's going to be on the final test. Those of you who are studying on your own as we progress along in this series, you can see the questions there and just help you make application to what we're about to say. Got them? Screenshot that? All right. Tonight's topic, which is really the last of the myths that I'm going to be able to cover in this 16-week series. There are others I could have and probably should have, but these are the ones that I decided to go with. But tonight we're going to deal with this idea of elevated priesthood. Let's go back to our passage that we have used over the last, I don't know, what is that, 7 or 8 of those things, 7 or 8 lessons to introduce the myths of Catholicism. 2 Timothy 4, Paul, writing to Timothy, makes this prophetic statement. The time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, and I told you repeatedly I'm confident that time is now, and it was at his time as well, but I think it's only unraveled further in our time. But having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. In other words, I'm not really interested in listening to what God has to say. I want to hear God say what I want to have said. And so verse 4, it says that they'll turn away from listening to the truth, God, and they'll wander off into myths. And we have covered those as you see them are on the screen there. We've covered that list thus far. So if you're interested in any of those and you weren't with us previously, pedal back in the series and you can cover some of those. But as we try to bring this to climax, before I give you that bullet point series like I said I was going to in the next lesson, as we try to bring this to climax, I want to suggest to you that probably among their greatest flaws with regards to the apostasy of Catholicism is this idea of the elevated priesthood. It goes all the way back to Peter in their minds, where Peter all of a sudden becomes elevated by Jesus to be a super apostle. He's somebody who's above the rest of them. That it's Peter who has received the keys to the kingdom. It's Peter who has been given this idea that you can bind on earth and it'll be bound in heaven, etc. And yet we know that actually, and again, pedal backwards in the series and you can find this entire discussion, but we know that Peter was not being established as the first pope. Peter was being given the opening volleys, if you will, of the kingdom. Peter himself was going to deliver the sermon on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And so what do you do with keys? You open something. And that's what that's the role that Jesus was giving to him. Peter, I'm going to let you open the doors to the kingdom. And Peter certainly did that. And then we also notice that when it comes to Peter and the supposed authority that he has received, and they then supposedly see this authority being passed down through the ages right into the papal palace of today, we need to recognize that what Jesus says to Peter, that what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Jesus gives that same level of authority to the rest of them as well, just a few chapters later. And so this was nothing unique to Peter. And so Peter was not some kind of an elevated pre-papal pontiff. Trying to keep all my P's in there. Peter was certainly a unique man. So he certainly was a talented individual. He certainly was qualified to do a lot of things for the Lord, or the Lord would not have used him. But he was not elevated to some level of super priesthood. And that's what we want to talk about this evening as we deal with this idea of elevated priesthood. First of all, I'd like for you to recognize that, I guess I should pull that screen down just a little bit so that I don't have that all over my face, all those horrible pictures of the pompous Pope. But the first thing we need to realize with regards to Christ's approval and would he give approval to an elevated priesthood is that obviously not, because of what he says in Matthew 23 and other places. We need to recognize that Jesus regularly lectured his people on elevated statuses. He regularly told his people, don't be doing that. Even if you go to the cleansing of the temple, you recognize that one of the reasons Jesus was doing that is because of all of the hypocrisy and the elevated statuses that were going on within the temple compound. But I want to come back to this passage, and I only want to emphasize verse 12 because at the end of the lesson, we're going to see the entire passage at length. But I want you to understand that what Jesus says here, when he speaks to the crowds, he speaks to his disciples, and he tells them, don't be like those folks, those pompous Jewish leaders, and all that they do. And we'll see that list later on in the lesson. But don't do that because, verse 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The obvious future of Catholicism is humiliation. The future of Catholicism is Jesus himself bringing them to their knees, asking them why they felt that they could be so, they felt so bold, they felt so full of themselves to wear fancy dresses and to desire the prime seats and all the stuff that they did. He's going to say to them in a very humiliating fashion, you took the glory that was designed for me. And I believe that in that he is going to assign them to hell for not repenting of the blasphemous, pompous arrogance of their religious pursuits. Whoever exalts himself, look at those pictures and tell me, is that not exalting? Well, look at that, especially the one on the far right there. I mean, there he is in his whatever hat, fancy dress. The guy's holding his gown out wide so that everybody can view him and to see how whoever exalts himself is going to be humbled. That guy, if he's not already on the other side, and I don't remember which pope that is, he's going to be humiliated by the Lord because he has found himself, or he has placed himself in a position, a pompous position, of actually trying to steal from the glory of the Lord. So the first thing I want you to see from Matthew 23 is that Jesus himself regularly lectured on elevated statuses. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. Consider Jesus washing the feet of his disciples in the upper room. Understand him as he would actually spend time with the prostitutes, the cast-off, the lepers. The leper who could have been healed simply by saying the word, but the passage said that Jesus actually touched him. The idea of us elevating ourselves when Jesus himself took upon himself the form of a servant. Go to the upper room, see him washing the dirty, grimy, stinky feet of Peter. Recognize Peter's words as he said, you're not going to do that to me, Lord. The man who they would assume, the Catholic Church would assume, was the forerunner of all the popes that were to come, was such a frail individual, an arrogant individual, a big mouth, somebody who just simply couldn't control his tongue, etc., etc. Now, you're going to see in the course of our time this evening that actually gets under control to some degree And you got to give Peter credit for that because he actually got the message. My question is, Catholics, will you get the message? Before it is eternally too late, will you get the message? Peter did. Will you get the message that Jesus is the one that we should elevate, we should have glory in? Not, as you can see in those pictures there, a bunch of men who like to parade themselves in fancy garments so that everybody will say, whoa, look at them. There are 3 points, the second of which is this. Not only did Jesus regularly lecture on elevated statuses, Jesus specifically lectured Peter, their supposed pope, on elevated statuses. And as you're going to see in the third point, I would like to suggest to you that it's important for Catholics especially, if you're going to think of Peter in such a super apostle way, you need to take and stop playing the hypocrite and actually go the path of Peter, who at some point, he evidently did think that he was all that. We're going to see that in Matthew 16. In fact, he thought he was so big and bad that he could actually rebuke Jesus. Think about that. Antichrist. Not unlike what Catholics do today. And again, stay with me in the last final lesson next time, and you're going to see this bullet point of Jesus said do this, Catholics do just the opposite. Jesus said do this, Catholics do just the opposite. It's anti-Christ. It's against Christ. Notice our passage, Matthew 16, beginning of verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, to be killed, and on the third day be raised. So Jesus is explaining to them, he's giving them heads up about what's coming down the pike. Peter, in all of his pompousness, decides that ain't happening. And notice what happens, not unlike the upper room, how Peter says, you're not doing that to me. Not unlike many other occasions where Peter was the first to pop off. Notice what Peter, their supposed first pope, says in verse 22. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Notice what Peter has done here. Peter's playing the part of the Antichrist. He is making Antichrist assertions. Antichrist in that he is opposed to Christ. Now, I know that that's true because of the way Jesus responds to him. But before we get to verse 23, I just want you to stop and park yourself a little bit in verse 22 and recognize what their supposed pope was willing to do. He was willing to get to a point where he assumed he could advise Jesus, that he somehow was in charge of this movement. And so he would say to Jesus, that ain't happening to you, Lord. Not unlike what the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy seems to think that they can do to Jesus. Now go to verse 23. Jesus turns to Peter and he says this, get behind me, Satan. Jesus refers to Peter as Satan because he's in the Antichrist mode. The Antichrist mode of saying, I can advise the Lord. Think about that. Get behind me, Satan. Peter and his Antichrist assertions. Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. Antichrist. You're standing in the way of my plan. My plan is a very humble plan. My plan is a plan based and rooted upon the humility of the home. Notice what Catholicism has done to this. They have done anything but go the route of humility. They have got an entire papal compound that is a country unto itself. All of the gold-plated everything. They are anything but simple. And rooted in the family? I think not. Their hierarchy is actually discouraged from having any personal understanding of what it's like to establish their own family. Antichrist. He says, you are a hindrance to me, Peter, not unlike the Catholic Church that wants to claim Peter as their first pope. And then he goes on to explain to Peter why he is referring to him as Satan, who is a hindrance to his mission. For you are not setting your mind on things of God, but watch it, on the things of man. The things of man. I can't think of a better phrase to describe Catholicism. When you look at their flowing dresses, their funny hats, you look at their elitist arrangement as far as their hierarchy is concerned. You look at their pompous cathedrals, the idolatry, carnality that they go through with regards to bowing before idols, etc. You just think about that. They are not thinking about God. If there's one sin that God has zeroed in on throughout the history of humanity, it is idolatry. And yet Catholicism will do everything that they can to suggest we are not actually idolaters. Yeah, we do bow in front of idols. Yeah, we do light candles. Yeah, we do honor these, and we do believe that there's holy there. It's in a holy location, and yeah, we do pray, but we're not idolaters. You begin to see how Catholicism is putting the things of man ahead of the things of God. I'll give you one last illustration, then we'll go into our third point. I have often argued with Catholics about all of the treasures that they have heaped up on earth. And they will try to explain those away as being important artifacts for history, human history. Go back to the statement. Setting your mind on things of God, but on things of man. You're not thinking about God, you're thinking about man. You're thinking about keeping all these artifacts, keeping all of these paintings, keeping all of this wealth of humanity because your mind is on man, not on God. Did Jesus himself not say that when we lay up treasures on earth, that it's going to bind our heart to the earth? For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The Catholic's treasure is immense, but it's all earthly. It's over there in Rome. Think about that. And if it's not in Rome, it's all trapped in one of their fancy cathedrals in your town or mine. Think about that. These are folks who are setting their mind on things of the earth, not on things of God. So, just like the man who they claim is their first pope, we find that they have played the part of the Antichrist, that they are a hindrance to Jesus, and that they are not placing their mind on things of God, but they're placing their mind on things of the earth, of man, and in that carnality, they are condemned as Antichrist in nature. Number 3, it's not just that Jesus regularly lectured on elevated statuses, and that he specifically lectured Peter, their supposed first pope, on elevated statuses. But Peter makes a change, God bless him. And then Peter, because he actually paid attention, unlike the Catholic hierarchy, he actually paid attention to Jesus. Instead of trying to replace him, instead of trying to make a throne on earth that they can sit on in replacing of Jesus, instead of doing it, Peter actually listens to the words of Christ. And I want you to notice here 2 passages where Peter himself now is going to talk about the elevated priesthood. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves live like living stones. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Elevated priesthood, absolutely. All of the church has been elevated out of the world, thus the word ecclesia, called out, elevated out of the world and into a position, all of us, men and women, all of us into a position where we can offer spiritual sacrifices. You'll notice that Peter, given the opportunity to elevate himself and to suggest to the world, I am your first pope, and therefore I say to you, we're going to have this elitist priesthood. He doesn't do that. When given the opportunity, instead of doing that, Peter says you're all priests. And as priests, you have the opportunity to offer spiritual sacrifices. Later on, Peter goes on to explain that or expand upon that in verses 9 through 11. He says, but you are a chosen race. Notice that. Yes, we experience an elevation. And it's an elevation out of the damnable nature of the world. We are the ecclesia, the called out of the world. And thus we become an elevated priesthood. But it's all of us. And by the way, all those in the world are also called to participate. If I be lifted up, I'll draw all men unto myself. Jesus desires for all of us to be priests. Not just those fellows who have the funny hats and run around those funny dresses. He wants all of us to be priests. But go back to our passage. A holy nation. He wants that for us, to be a holy nation, a people of his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had received mercy, once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And then I want you to see verse 11, because I think it's very conclusionary in what Peter is saying here. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which war against your soul. Notice he refers to them as sojourners, not individuals who will build a palace in Rome and dig their anchor deep in the earth with all of their carnal treasures that Jesus said don't lay up on earth. He says you're sojourners. You need to be people who recognize you're on the path out, not on the path to staying. And then he goes on to say that they are exiles, that we are here not to be people who dominate, physically speaking, the planet. We're exiles here. Our desire is to go. And so when Catholics boast of having 1.3 billion adherents, or whatever the number is presently, and when they boast of having all these cathedrals scattered all over, and when they boast of building all of these hospitals, and when they boast, and when they boast, and when they boast, I remind them that all of those boastings are of the world, of the earth, of humanity. Jesus led a very simple religious pursuit. And when you lay the life of Jesus beside the life of the Pope, you have no similarities. The Pope, as he places his head on those silken pillows every night, has no clue, none, that Jesus would go to a cross, be stripped naked of the only real possessions he had, because he loved us. He lived such a simple life, walking from town to town, his feet constantly covered in dirt, dealing with the poor, never asking to be put up in some pompous palace. He would have felt out of place there, but not the Pope. Come back now to verse 11. As we conclude this idea of all of us being priests, he says, I urge you as sojourners, as exiles, abstain from the passions of the flesh. One of the greatest passions of the flesh is to be accepted, to be admired. And we're going to see in this passage one last time as we conclude this lesson that Jesus is going to say, if that's your drive, if that's your desire, understand this, you will be humbled. And it seems to be the drive of the Catholic hierarchy. Lastly, he says, verse 11, all of these passions, to be first, to be recognized, to have all the glory and all the stuff surrounding you, he says it wages against your soul. That's not unlike the words of our Lord when he said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Thus, prior to that, don't lay up treasures on earth, because your treasure on earth, that's where your heart is. And you look at Catholicism, and that's exactly what they've done. They've laid up their treasure on the earth. Well, let's return, before ending, let's return to that passage one more time. And this time you'll notice that I've underlined a lot of things, because I just like for you to march through this and compare what Jesus is saying in Matthew 23 with these pictures that you see there at the right. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, speaking of the religious hierarchy of his day, he says, you know what they do? They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. They lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves not willing to move them with their finger. Not unlike the Pope and all of his entourage demanding sacrifices from folks around the world, some of them dirt poor, so that they can live in opulence there in the midst of their papal palace. Verse 5, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. Does that describe these pictures that you see on the screen? For they make their phylacteries, I always had trouble with that word, phylacteries, broad and their fringes long. Speaking of the robes that they would wear. In other words, they have parts of their robe that would be very showy. so that people would recognize them as a holy person. And I just want you to look at those pictures. And I ask you, does that not look like it's exactly what Jesus is speaking against? Verse 6. And they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats. You notice there that bottom picture where the Pope is getting a microphone placed in front of him and all of his grandioseness, because he likes to have that kind of attention. Notice, if you will, over there to the right again, this guy walking down there with his long flowing dress being held out wide so that everybody can notice the pompous glory of the Pope. Notice the fellow there up in the center sitting on his throne. Does that not sound like what's going on in verse 6, that Jesus is condemning that very idea? They love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue, greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But then you get into this difficult passage, verses 8 and following, where he begins to list things that all of us to some degree have actually been guilty of, sort of, or maybe. I think once I explain it, you understand that really this passage is about elevated statuses, not so much these particular titles. He says that we are not to call anybody rabbi. Rabbi just simply means teacher. I got to be honest with you. Growing up, I had several teachers, and I referred to them as teachers. So am I doomed for hell because of that? Call no man father on earth. I got to be honest with you. I've got a dad who lives just next door, and I've called him father on occasions, and I've got some spiritual people, young people in my life who actually think of me as being their spiritual father. So am I doomed for hell? Neither be called instructors. That's a little bit like a rabbi back there in verse whatever that is, verse 8. So verse 10 is a lot like that one. For you have one instructor, and that's Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Again, you don't see any of that going on in these pictures over here to the right. But then he makes this statement, this conclusionary statement that we saw at the opening, but I think it's very important to the context. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That is the criteria by which you judge these titles that have been listed: rabbi, father, instructor, etc. He's saying, if you are pursuing these titles for the purpose of being elevated above others, then you got a problem. I think it is possible to call somebody a rabbi without trying to elevate them above anybody, or an instructor, or even father. But that's not what happens in the Catholic Church. You're aware, I suspect, that not only is the Pope called Father, but he is often referred to as Holy Father. Why is it important to them to make sure that they've got that preceding word before Father, Holy Father? Is that not an effort, to elevate, to put him on an even higher plane than others? Go back to the very words of Peter, the one who thought he could challenge Jesus, the one who took the path of the Antichrist doctrines earlier in his life, but eventually the bell rung in his head, the light came on, and he repented of that. Go back and recall what Peter says to the church. We're all priests. There is no elevated priesthood. We are all priests. We are all worthy because of the blood of Jesus. We are worthy to offer sacrifices to the Lord. Now, there are special stations within the church. I get that. A shepherd, an evangelist, individual a deacon. I get that there are special stations within the church that are given special responsibilities. And in that, it's okay to acknowledge them for being what they are. A shepherd is a shepherd. An overseer is an overseer. There's no problem with that. But to elevate them as if they have some kind of super spiritual status that allows them to wear a funny hat with flowing dresses, make sure that they have all the attention like that bottom picture there, etc. This elevated status is what Jesus is against. And I'm convinced that in Matthew 23, that's what the entire passage is about, that. Elevated statuses. And you don't see a more vivid picture of elevated statuses than when you look at the Catholic Church. That's why I call it Antichrist. Jesus gives us Matthew 23, and all of a sudden, what do? You see a church that's got people who are doing things so that they can be seen by others, with their phylacteries all wide and their fringes long, taking the best seats, wanting to be called by special titles. What does Jesus say in verse 12? Whoever exalts himself will be what? Humbled. I am absolutely convinced that one day, in a great throng of people, you will find the popes of the past who pompously attempted to replace Jesus, humiliated by the Lord for their lack of humility, their desire to wear fancy hats and flowing gowns, rather than to be humble like Jesus. Here are the 5 questions we attempted to answer during that time together. I pray that we've covered them well. Again, as I said in the opening, I remind you our next lesson is going to be a bullet point list that, to me, the sheer volume of things said is enough to convince me of the Antichrist status of the Catholic Church. I think it'll surprise you as well, as we just rapidly go down and we'll see. Jesus says this, they do that. Jesus says this, they do that. So please join me next time as we try to cover that material. Thank you for joining me this time. I love you. Sonny Chow saying be there. Matthew 16:26.